The morning sun cast long shadows across Kensington Palace as Prince William stood at his office window, holding a steaming cup of tea. His mind wandered to the conversation he'd had with his mother, Princess Diana, years ago when he was just a child himself. She had taken him to see the homeless shelters, explaining that being royal meant caring for those who had less. Now, as a father, he felt the weight of that responsibility more deeply than ever. Prince George, now 11 years old, had been asking difficult questions lately. Just last week, while driving through London, he had noticed people sleeping rough on the streets and asked his father why some people didn't have homes. The innocence in his son's voice had stirred something profound in William's heart. It was time to continue the tradition his mother had started, teaching the next generation about compassion and service. William walked down the palace corridor, his footsteps echoing softly on the polished floors. Family portraits lined the walls, reminding him of generations of royals who had served before him. His grandmother, Queen Elizabeth, had always emphasized duty above all else. His father, now King Charles, had shown him the importance of environmental and social causes. But it was his mother's legacy of touching hearts and changing lives that called to him most strongly today. He found George in the schoolroom, bent over his mathematics homework. The young prince looked up with bright blue eyes that reminded William so much of Diana. "Papa, can we go somewhere together today?" George asked, setting down his pencil. "Somewhere important?" William smiled, remembering how he used to ask his own mother the same question. "Actually, George, I was hoping you'd say that. There's something very special I want to show you. Something that will help you understand what it means to be a prince in the modern world." Catherine appeared in the doorway, having overheard their conversation. Her warm smile told William she understood exactly what he was planning. They had discussed this moment many times. When would be the right time to introduce George to the harsher realities of life outside the palace walls? Today felt right. "Are we going on an adventure?" George asked, his eyes lighting up with excitement. At 11, he still possessed that wonderful enthusiasm for new experiences, untainted by the cynicism that often came with age and privilege. "We are," William replied, kneeling down to George's level. "But this isn't going to be like our usual outings. Today, we're going to meet some people who need our help. People who don't have the comfortable life we're blessed with." The weight of William's words settled over the room. Catherine moved closer, placing a gentle hand on George's shoulder. She had been homeless herself for a brief period as a young adult, though few people knew that story. It had shaped her understanding of vulnerability and the thin line between security and desperation. As they prepared to leave, William's mind drifted back to his first visit to a homeless shelter with his mother. He had been about George's age, nervous and uncertain about what he would encounter. Diana had held his hand tightly as they walked through the doors of the shelter, and he could still remember the mixture of fear and curiosity he had felt. The car ride through London was quiet, with George pressing his face against the window, watching the city pass by. William pointed out landmarks they passed: Big Ben, the Thames, historic buildings that represented centuries of British history. But, today, their destination was far removed from the grandeur of royal palaces and tourist attractions. They were heading to Crisis, a homelessness charity that William had been supporting quietly for several years. The organization worked tirelessly to provide not just shelter, but education, job training, and support services to help people rebuild their lives. William had visited many times before, but always alone or with other adults. This was George's first introduction to this side of royal duty. "Papa," George said quietly as they drove through a less affluent part of London, "why do some people not have houses?" William considered his answer carefully. How do you explain to a child who has never wanted for anything that life could be so different for others? How do you convey the complexity of homelessness, the mental health struggles, the economic hardships, the family breakdowns, the addiction issues, in terms an 11-year-old could understand? "Sometimes, George, people face very difficult situations," William began. "They might lose their jobs, or get sick, or have family problems. When these things happen, they might not be able to pay for their homes anymore. Some people don't have families to help them, like we help each other." George nodded thoughtfully. "But can't someone help them?" That's exactly why we're here today, William replied. There are good people who try to help, and, sometimes, we can help too. That's part of what being royal means, using our position to make life better for others. As they approached the crisis center, William felt the familiar mixture of emotions that always came with these visits. There was sadness for the suffering he would witness, but also hope for the resilience and strength he knew he would see. The human spirit's ability to endure and overcome never ceased to amaze him. The building itself was modest, a converted warehouse in an area of London that most tourists never saw. There were no grand entrances or red carpets here, just a simple door marked with the Crisis logo and a sign welcoming visitors. William had specifically requested that their visit be low-key, with minimal security presence and no media coverage. This wasn't about photo opportunities or public relations, this was about education and genuine human connection. John Sparks, the chief executive of Crisis, met them at the entrance. A warm, genuine man in his 50s, John had dedicated his career to fighting homelessness. He understood the delicate balance required when introducing young people to these realities, the need to educate without traumatizing, to inspire compassion without overwhelming. George, John said, extending his hand to the young prince, thank you for coming today. We're going to meet some very special people who have important stories to tell. As they walked through the corridors, William noticed George taking everything in with wide eyes. The building buzzed with activity, people attending computer classes, others meeting with job advisors, some simply sitting in the common area, finally, having a warm, safe place to rest. The atmosphere was one of hope and determination, despite the circumstances that had brought everyone there. Their first stop was the education center, where adults were working on basic literacy and numeracy skills. Many of the people here had missed out on education due to chaotic childhoods, mental health issues, or other life circumstances. Now, with stable housing and support, they were getting a second chance to learn. William watched as George observed a man in his 40s carefully writing out letters on lined paper. The man looked up and smiled at George, explaining that he was learning to read so he could write letters to his daughter, whom he hoped to reunite with once he got back on his feet. I want to tell her I'm sorry, the man said simply. And that I love her. George listened intently, and William could see his son trying to process the complexity of adult relationships and the pain of family separation. These were concepts far removed from George's secure world, but William knew it was important for him to understand that not everyone had the same advantages. In the job training workshop, they met Maria, a woman in her 30s who was learning computer skills. She had been sleeping rough for 2 years after escaping an abusive relationship. With no family to turn to and limited work experience, she had found herself on the streets with nowhere to go. I was so scared, Maria told them, her voice steady but her eyes reflecting the memory of that fear. I'd never been homeless before. I didn't know where to go or what to do. But the people here, they helped me believe I could start again. Maria showed George the website she was building as part of her training course. It was a simple site about pet care. She dreamed of opening her own pet grooming business one day. George was fascinated by the technical aspects, asking questions about how websites worked and what Maria planned to do next. You're very smart, George told her earnestly, making Maria smile for the first time since they'd started talking. William felt a swell of pride in his son's natural empathy and curiosity. These were the qualities that would make him a good king one day, the ability to connect with people from all walks of life and to see the humanity in everyone he met. Their next stop was the accommodation area, where people who had been sleeping rough could stay while they worked on getting their lives back together. The rooms were small but clean and private, a stark contrast to the uncertainty and danger of life on the streets. They met David, a former soldier who had struggled with post-traumatic stress disorder after returning from Afghanistan. Unable to cope with civilian life and without adequate support, he had lost his job, his apartment, and eventually found himself homeless. The trauma of war, combined with the shame of his situation, had made it difficult for him to ask for help. I thought I was strong enough to handle anything, David explained to William and George. In the army, we're taught to be tough, to push through no matter what. But some things break you in ways you don't expect. George listened carefully as David described his journey from the battlefield to the streets to the safety of the crisis center. The young prince asked thoughtful questions about what it was like to be a soldier, and David's face lit up as he shared stories of camaraderie and service that had nothing to do with his current struggles. The hardest part, David continued, wasn't the sleeping outside or the hunger. It was feeling invisible. People would walk past like I wasn't there. Like I didn't matter. William nodded, understanding the profound impact of human dignity and recognition. This was something his mother had taught him, that sometimes the most powerful thing you could do was simply acknowledge someone's existence and worth. In the common area, they sat with a group of people sharing lunch. The conversation was lively and diverse, people talking about job interviews, upcoming family visits, dreams for the future. William was struck, as he always was, by the ordinariness of these extraordinary people. They weren't statistics or problems to be solved, they were individuals with hopes, fears, talents, and stories. George joined in naturally, asking about people's interests and sharing his own love of football and flying. The barriers of age, class, and circumstance seemed to melt away as they discovered common ground. One woman, Patricia, had been a teacher before personal tragedies led to her homelessness. She and George bonded over their shared love of history, and she told him fascinating stories about medieval England that weren't in any of his textbooks. "You know," Patricia said to George, "being here has taught me that anyone can face hard times. But it's also taught me that there's always hope, especially when people care enough to help." As the afternoon wore on, William watched his son's understanding deepen. George asked fewer questions about why people were homeless and more questions about what they planned to do next, how they felt now that they had support, and what their dreams were for the future. The transformation in George's perspective was visible. He was beginning to understand that homelessness wasn't a character flaw or a choice, but a circumstance that could happen to anyone facing the wrong combination of challenges. More importantly, he was seeing that people experiencing homelessness weren't defined by their situation, they were complex individuals with rich inner lives and valuable contributions to make. Before leaving, they visited the crisis intervention team, who worked with people in the most acute situations. These were the frontline workers who responded to calls about people sleeping rough, who built trust with individuals who had often lost faith in institutions and authority figures. Sarah, one of the outreach workers, explained her role to George. "Sometimes people have been let down so many times that they don't trust anyone trying to help them. My job is to show up consistently, to prove that we're reliable, and to be patient while they decide if they're ready to accept support." She told them about Marcus, a man she had been working with for 6 months before he finally agreed to come to the center. He had been sleeping in doorways and abandoned buildings, surviving on scraps and the occasional kindness of strangers. Mental health issues and a series of bad experiences with social services had made him deeply suspicious of offers of help. "But we never gave up on him," Sarah continued. "And, eventually, he realized we weren't going away." That consistency, that reliability, for some people, that's the first step toward believing they deserve help. Marcus was there that day, having recently moved into temporary accommodation. He shook hands gravely with both William and George, thanking them for visiting. "People like you coming here," he said, "it shows that we matter. That we're not forgotten." As they prepared to leave, John Sparks pulled William aside for a brief conversation about the center's funding challenges and expansion plans. While they talked, George sat with a group of residents who were playing cards, easily joining their game and their laughter. William watched his son and felt a profound sense of satisfaction. This was exactly what he had hoped for, not just education about homelessness, but genuine human connection. George wasn't looking at these people as objects of pity or charity cases. He was seeing them as individuals, each with their own story and their own worth. The drive back to Kensington Palace was quiet for a different reason than the journey there. Both William and George were processing what they had experienced, each lost in their own thoughts about the afternoon's encounters. "Papa," George finally said as they turned into the palace gates, "those people were really nice. They didn't seem like what I thought homeless people would be like." "What did you think they would be like?" William asked gently. George considered this. "I don't know, maybe scary, or unfriendly. But they were just normal. Like people we might meet anywhere." "That's exactly right, George. They are just like people you might meet anywhere. The only difference is that they've faced some very difficult challenges, and they need help getting back on their feet. As they walked back into the palace, William felt the weight of privilege more acutely than usual. The contrast between the modest crisis center and the opulent surroundings of their home was stark and sobering. But, rather than feeling guilty about their advantages, William felt energized about the responsibility that came with them. That evening, over dinner, George excitedly told Catherine about everything he had seen and learned. His enthusiasm was infectious, and William could see that the day had planted important seeds in his son's mind and heart. "Can we go back again?" George asked. "I want to see how Marcus is doing, and I want to help Maria with her website." William and Catherine exchanged glances, both recognizing the significance of George's response. This wasn't just curiosity or a temporary interest. Their son was beginning to understand his role as someone who could make a difference in other people's lives. "Of course we can go back," William replied. "In fact, I think we should make it a regular part of what we do. What do you think about that?" George nodded enthusiastically, already planning what he might bring next time or questions he wanted to ask the people he had met. Later that night, after George had gone to bed, William stood once again at his office window, looking out at the London skyline. The lights of the city twinkled in the distance, and he thought about all the lives behind those lights, the struggles and triumphs, the hopes and fears that played out in countless homes and on countless streets. His phone buzzed with a text message from John Sparks. "Thank you for bringing George today." His genuine interest and kindness made a real impression on everyone. "We look forward to seeing you both again soon." William smiled, feeling a deep sense of fulfillment. Today had been about more than just showing George the realities of homelessness. It had been about passing on values, about nurturing empathy, about preparing the next generation of royals to serve with authenticity and compassion. As he prepared for bed, William thought about his mother and how proud she would be of the man George was becoming. Diana's legacy lived on, not just in the charities that bore her name or the causes she had championed, but in the hearts and minds of her grandchildren who would carry forward her commitment to using privilege for the greater good. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and responsibilities, but tonight, William felt hopeful about the future. The monarchy would continue to evolve, but its commitment to service and compassion would remain constant, passed down through generations like a sacred trust. In his bedroom down the hall, George lay awake thinking about Marcus and Maria and David and all the others he had met. He thought about their stories, their dreams, and their courage in the face of hardship. And he began to understand, in his young heart, what it truly meant to be a prince in the modern world. 3 weeks had passed since that transformative day at the crisis center, and Prince George's perspective on the world had shifted in ways that both surprised and delighted his parents. The 11-year-old prince had become something of an advocate for homeless causes within the palace walls, asking his tutors to include lessons about social inequality in his studies and requesting books about homelessness from the royal library. Catherine noticed the change most clearly during their daily conversations. Where once George might have complained about having to finish his vegetables or clean his room, he now spoke with genuine gratitude for the comforts they enjoyed. He had started saying grace before meals, thanking not just for their food but for their warm home and safe beds. "Mama," George had said just the night before, "I keep thinking about Marcus sleeping outside for so long. How did he stay warm? How did he find food every day?" These questions weighed heavily on Catherine's heart. She remembered her own brief experience with housing instability in her early 20s, before she met William. Though she had never been completely homeless, she had spent several anxious weeks staying with friends, uncertain about her future housing situation. That experience had given her a deep empathy for those facing far worse circumstances. William had been watching his son's development with growing pride and concern. George's increased awareness of social issues was exactly what he had hoped for, but he worried about burdening such a young mind with the weight of the world's problems. The balance between education and innocence was delicate, especially for a child destined for a lifetime of public service. The morning sun streamed through the windows of William's study as he reviewed his schedule for the day. Among the usual royal engagements and official meetings was a note from his private secretary: "George has requested to accompany you on homeless-related engagements. Lady Catherine supports this, with appropriate preparation and boundaries. William smiled at his son's initiative. George had apparently approached Catherine directly, asking if he could join his father on more visits to homeless services. The young prince had even suggested they could donate some of his toys and clothes to children in homeless shelters, an idea that showed both generosity and practical thinking. There was a soft knock on the study door, and George peered in with his characteristic smile. He was already dressed for the day in his school clothes, but William could see the hopeful expression that meant his son wanted to discuss something important. "Papa, I've been thinking," George began, settling into the leather chair across from William's desk, "about the people we met at Crisis. I want to do something to help them." William set down his papers and gave George his full attention. "What did you have in mind?" "Well," George continued, his words coming faster as his excitement grew, "I thought maybe we could organize a collection at school. My friends could bring things that homeless people need, like warm clothes and food. And maybe we could visit more places like Crisis to see how else we can help." The innocence and determination in George's voice reminded William so strongly of Diana that he had to pause for a moment. His mother had possessed that same combination of compassion and practical action, the ability to see a problem and immediately start thinking of solutions. "Those are wonderful ideas, George," William said warmly. "But I want to make sure you understand what we'd be taking on. Working with homeless charities isn't always easy. Sometimes we meet people who are struggling with very difficult problems, and we can't fix everything for them." George nodded seriously. "I know, Papa. But even if we can't help everyone, we can still help someone, right? And maybe other people will see what we're doing and want to help too." The wisdom in this simple statement struck William profoundly. George was already grasping one of the fundamental principles of effective charity work, that individual action could inspire broader social change, that royal involvement could shine a light on important causes and encourage others to get involved. Catherine joined them in the study, having overheard their conversation from the hallway. "George has been talking about this for days," she said, settling beside her son. "He's been researching homeless charities online and asking his tutors about the history of royal charitable work. I learned that great-grandmother Diana visited lots of homeless places," George added. "And that she helped change how people think about homeless people. I want to do that too." William felt his throat tighten with emotion. The legacy of his mother continued to inspire not just him, but now his own children. Diana's work had indeed changed public perception of homelessness, transforming it from a hidden shame to a recognized social issue deserving of attention and resources. "Your grandmother would be very proud of you," William said quietly. "She always believed that royal privilege should be used to help those who needed it most." They decided to start with another visit to Crisis, this time with George taking a more active role in planning and preparation. William contacted John Sparks to arrange a follow-up visit, explaining George's interest in getting more involved. John was delighted by the young prince's enthusiasm and suggested they could meet with some of the service users George had connected with during his first visit. The days leading up to their second visit were filled with preparation. George worked with his tutors to research the causes of homelessness, learning about economic factors, mental health issues, addiction, and family breakdown. He also studied successful homelessness initiatives from other countries, showing a sophisticated understanding of policy and social services that impressed his teachers. Catherine helped George organize a small collection among palace staff, gathering toiletries, warm clothing, and small comfort items that could be distributed to people using homeless services. George insisted on contributing several of his own possessions, including a favorite book that he thought someone might enjoy reading. "I want to give them something that's actually mine," he explained to his parents. "Not just things we bought specially. Something that was important to me." This gesture revealed the depth of George's understanding about meaningful giving. He was learning that charity wasn't just about disposing of excess possessions, but about sharing things that held personal value, about making genuine sacrifices for others. The second visit to Crisis began differently from the first. Where George had been nervous and uncertain during his initial visit, he now approached the building with confidence and purpose. He carried a bag of donations and had prepared specific questions to ask the people he hoped to meet again. John Sparks greeted them warmly, immediately noting George's increased comfort and engagement. "Welcome back, Your Royal Highness," he said to George with a small bow. "Everyone here has been looking forward to seeing you again." Their first stop was the Education Center, where George had specifically requested to see the man who was learning to write letters to his daughter. Thomas was there, still working diligently on his literacy skills, but now with several completed letters on the desk beside him. "George," Thomas said with genuine pleasure when he saw the young prince. "Look, I finished my first letter to Lucy. The staff here helped me mail it yesterday." George examined Thomas's careful handwriting with the seriousness of an expert evaluator. "Your writing is getting so much better," he said earnestly. "What did you tell Lucy in your letter?" Thomas's eyes misted slightly as he explained that he had told his daughter about his new home at Crisis, about the classes he was taking, and about his hope to see her soon. "I told her about meeting you too," Thomas added with a smile. "She was very impressed that her dad had met a real prince." "Did she write back?" George asked, genuinely invested in this developing father-daughter relationship. "Not yet," Thomas replied, "but the social worker says she's allowed to visit next month if I keep doing well with my recovery program. I'm learning to read better so we can read stories together when she comes." George reached into his bag and pulled out one of his own books, a collection of adventure stories that had been one of his favorites. "Maybe you could practice reading this," he offered. "And then, when Lucy visits, you could read her some of the stories." Thomas accepted the book with reverence, as if he were being handed a precious treasure. "Are you sure you want to give this away? It looks like something special." "That's exactly why I want you to have it," George replied with the wisdom of someone far older than 11. "Because it's special to me, and now it can be special for you and Lucy too." William watched this exchange with profound pride and a growing understanding of his son's character. George wasn't just learning about charity, he was developing a genuine capacity for empathy and sacrifice that would serve him well in his future role. Their next stop was the Job Training Center, where Maria was continuing her computer studies. She greeted George like an old friend, excitedly showing him the progress she had made on her pet grooming website. The site now included pages about different dog breeds, grooming techniques, and pricing for services. "I've been practicing on the dogs at the animal shelter," Maria explained to George. "The staff there lets me volunteer in exchange for getting experience with different types of dogs. It's perfect practice for when I start my own business." George studied the website carefully, asking technical questions about how certain features worked and offering suggestions for additional content. His natural curiosity about technology, combined with his genuine interest in Maria's success, made for an engaging conversation that drew the attention of other service users. "You know," Maria said as they talked, "having you visit and ask about my dreams makes them feel more real. When someone important takes your plans seriously, it makes you take them more seriously too." This observation struck William as particularly insightful. One of the most powerful things about royal visits wasn't just the attention they brought to causes, but the dignity and validation they provided to individuals who often felt overlooked by society. They found Marcus in the common area, playing chess with another resident. He looked healthier than he had during their first meeting, with better color in his cheeks and less tension in his shoulders. The stability of regular meals and safe housing was clearly having a positive impact on his physical and mental well-being. "George!" Marcus called out, genuinely pleased to see the young prince. "Come here, I want to teach you to play chess properly." George settled beside Marcus at the chessboard, and soon they were engaged in an intense game that drew a small crowd of observers. Marcus proved to be an excellent teacher, patient and encouraging as he explained strategy and technique. Other residents offered commentary and advice, creating a warm, inclusive atmosphere that reminded William of family game nights at the palace. "You're getting good at this," Marcus told George as they played. "Chess teaches you to think ahead, to consider all the possibilities before you make a move. That's a skill that will help you in lots of areas of life." "Like being a prince?" George asked, moving his knight carefully across the board. "Especially like being a prince," Marcus replied seriously. "You'll have to make decisions that affect lots of people. Chess teaches you to think about consequences, to plan several steps ahead. As they played, Marcus shared more of his story with George. He had actually been quite successful before his struggles began. He had worked as an accountant for a small firm and had owned his own apartment. But a series of traumatic events, including the death of his parents in a car accident and the subsequent development of severe anxiety and depression, had gradually destroyed his ability to cope with daily life. "I stopped going to work because I couldn't concentrate," Marcus explained, his attention split between the chess game and his story. "Then, I couldn't pay my bills. Then, I lost my apartment. It all happened faster than I thought possible." George listened intently while considering his next move on the chessboard. "But, you're getting better now, right? You'll be able to get your own place again?" "That's the plan," Marcus replied with cautious optimism. "I'm working with a counselor here, and I'm starting to feel like myself again. The hardest part was learning to ask for help. I thought asking for help meant I was weak, but really it takes strength to admit when you need support." This conversation gave George a more nuanced understanding of homelessness than many adults possessed. He was learning that it wasn't a simple matter of bad choices or laziness, but often the result of complex circumstances that could overwhelm anyone's ability to cope. After their chess game, they joined a group discussion led by Sarah, the outreach worker they had met on their previous visit. She was facilitating a session where current residents shared their experiences and advice with newcomers to the program. George listened as people talked about the practical challenges of rebuilding their lives, finding work with gaps in employment history, managing limited finances, dealing with the bureaucracy of social services. But he also heard stories of resilience, hope, and mutual support that inspired him. Patricia, the former teacher, spoke about how the experience of homelessness had changed her perspective on education and privilege. "I used to think that success was just a matter of hard work," she said. "But now I understand that lots of factors beyond our control affect our opportunities. It's made me more compassionate, both toward myself and toward others." David, the former soldier, talked about the importance of community and connection in recovery. "The worst part of being homeless wasn't the physical discomfort," he said. "It was feeling isolated and forgotten. Having people here who understand what you're going through makes all the difference." George raised his hand tentatively, wanting to contribute to the discussion. "I've been thinking about what you all have taught me," he said, his voice clear and thoughtful. "Before I met you, I thought being a prince meant just going to fancy events and living in a palace. But now I think it means using the advantages I have to help other people have better lives too." The room fell quiet as the adults processed this remarkably mature observation from an 11-year-old. Then, Patricia smiled warmly and said, "That sounds like exactly the right understanding of what leadership should be." As their visit continued, William noticed how naturally George interacted with everyone they met. There was no condescension or pity in his manner, just genuine interest and respect. He asked thoughtful questions, remembered details from their previous conversations, and offered encouragement without making promises he couldn't keep. During lunch, they sat with a diverse group of residents ranging in age from their early 20s to their 60s. The conversation flowed easily, covering topics from current events to personal interests to dreams for the future. George shared stories about school and his love of football, while others talked about their work training programs and housing search efforts. One young woman, Amy, had recently started a part-time job at a local cafe and was excited about the prospect of earning her own money again. "It's only a few hours a week," she said, "but it feels amazing to have somewhere to be, something useful to do. The customers don't know my history, they just see someone who makes good coffee and is friendly to talk to." "That must feel really good," George observed. "Like you're getting to be yourself again, not just someone who needs help." Amy nodded enthusiastically. "Exactly. Everyone here has been wonderful and supportive, but there's something special about interacting with the outside world again, about feeling normal." This insight helped George understand another dimension of homelessness recovery, the importance of dignity and independence, not just shelter and services. People needed more than just their basic needs met, they needed opportunities to contribute, to feel valued for their abilities rather than pitted for their circumstances. Before leaving, they visited the crisis shop, where donated items were sorted and distributed to people in need. George was fascinated by the organization required to manage such a large operation, asking detailed questions about how items were collected, sorted, and allocated. The volunteer coordinator, Jenny, explained that they tried to ensure people could choose items they actually wanted and needed, rather than just accepting whatever was available. "Dignity is about having choices," she said. "Even small choices, like picking out your own clothes or selecting books you're interested in reading." George helped sort through some of the items they had brought, carefully organizing toiletries and checking that clothing was clean and in good condition. He took the task seriously, understanding that these weren't just random donations but items that would directly impact someone's daily life. "I want to make sure everything is perfect," he told Jenny as he folded a donated sweater. "Whoever gets this should feel like they're receiving something special, not just something we didn't want anymore." As they prepared to leave Crisis for the second time, George made rounds to say goodbye to everyone they had met. He promised to come back soon and asked several people to keep in touch about their progress with housing, jobs, and family reunification efforts. The drive home was filled with animated conversation as George processed everything he had experienced. He talked about the chess strategies Marcus had taught him, Maria's business plans, and Thomas's upcoming visit with his daughter. But he also asked deeper questions about systemic issues and potential solutions. "Papa," George said as they approached Kensington Palace, "why isn't there enough housing for everyone who needs it? And why don't people get help earlier, before they become homeless?" These were complex policy questions that even adults struggled to answer, but William attempted to explain the various factors involved: housing costs, availability of support services, political priorities, and resource allocation. George listened intently, clearly trying to understand how all these pieces fit together. "It seems like if we could prevent people from becoming homeless in the first place, that would be better than helping them after they're already on the streets," George observed. "That's exactly right," William replied, impressed by his son's grasp of the concept of preventive intervention. "That's what many charity organizations and government programs are trying to do, catch people before they fall through the cracks." That evening, George spent considerable time writing in a journal that Catherine had given him to record his thoughts and experiences related to their charity work. He wrote about the people he had met, the things he had learned, and his ideas for future involvement in homelessness causes. Before bed, George approached his parents with a carefully prepared proposal. He wanted to establish a regular schedule of visits to homeless services, organize ongoing donation drives at school, and begin learning more about housing policy and social services. "I also think Princess Charlotte and Prince Louis should start learning about this too," George added seriously. "When they're old enough, they should understand what our responsibilities are." William and Catherine exchanged glances, both recognizing that their eldest son was maturing rapidly and developing a sophisticated understanding of his future role. George's desire to include his siblings showed not just compassion for those in need, but strategic thinking about how to maximize the royal